information. Okay, could you just uh
Allow recording, Ahmed.
yeah, yeah, is that okay? All right, fantastic.
Got it.
Recording in progress.
All right, good evening, Uwe Parpart. Thank you very much for joining us.
Yeah, hi, Richard.
As
Good
always,
to
a
be back.
pleasure to talk to you. Of course, in the past in a different platform, we had the opportunity to talk about the latest with the BRICS, with China, US competition, and Russia. But over the past 2 months, a lot has changed. And one of the big headlines nowadays is supposedly peak China, or at least the economic slowdown in China. I remember just a year ago or something, we had some conversations about China coming back into action, the restrictions being lifted. I think there was a lot of optimism back then that China will keep on roaring in the post-pandemic era. But things are looking a little bit different right now, Uva. Could you share your just preliminary analysis first before we go down to the bare to the analysis?
Well, look, Chinese chose a lockdown way of dealing with the pandemic. Many other countries partially did that. Some didn't do it at all. My own view all along was that lockdowns are nonsense and will not actually make a whole lot of difference. But who am I to say? The actual effect on the Chinese economy of that was significant. Clearly, especially the Shanghai region, suffered very significantly. Um, Now, how do you come back once you release workers, once you, even if you don't lay them off, though they need to still get back into the swing of things? That started happening in the first quarter of this year. And at the same time as that happened, certain other difficulties that had arisen in the Chinese economy came to the fore, primarily
Right.
the problems with the real estate market, the property market. And the only really comparable type of situation that I could point to is the real estate crisis in the United States in the 1990s, which was resolved and led to a whole new asset class that resolved it, namely so-called mortgage-backed securities.
Right.
So China is now coping with the same problem, and it is also coping with a problem of being able to exercise central control over the economy as opposed to allowing local governments to basically do whatever they feel like doing and do it very often in a very inefficient and in fact corrupt manner. So,
Mm-hmm.
so China is now dealing with the aftermath of the pandemic, and at the same time, the aftermath of the development of a property bubble, which is causing difficulties. The second thing it's doing, which is the most important thing, is massively investing in what is called Industrialization 4.0. Basically 5G and artificial intelligence driven industrial development. So
Which
it's
is
an
inspired by
economy in transition.
Germany, right? It has some German inspiration last time I checked, right?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
There's a close connection with the German economy. Some of the major German companies like Siemens, on the automobile companies like Volkswagen, Audi and BMW, Mercedes, all involved in that. And it's a very close collaboration, even though the United States has been doing everything it can to prevent it from happening. So.
Um, Ove, you mentioned the 1990s because I think this is interesting because usually people are looking at two other major real estate driven crises. One is, of course, the ninja situation that led to the 2007-8 Great Recession. But the other one, the even more dramatic one, was the bubble burst in Japan in the 1980s, which created its own lost decade. So you're arguing that
Right.
it's not as severe as those two situations. either what created the Lehman Brothers collapse
Oh,
eventually, nor the Japanese contraction bubble burst in the 1980s.
no, I mean, the Japanese property bubble was absurd. I mean, there was a
Mm,
time when the interior, I worked in Japan at the time
yeah,
for Mitsubishi Bank. There was a time when the central Tokyo real estate value was about the same as the entirety of the United States.
yeah.
So, just give you an
Right.
idea.
And the palace in
Um,
Tokyo as worth as big as entire California, if I'm not mistaken, right? That
Of
ridiculous.
course, no, no, way larger than that,
Yeah,
much.
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So, so of course, it was completely unsustainable, and it ruined the Japanese economy for 2 decades.
Mm,
Indeed, arguably until now, because I don't really see any significant recovery in Japan. So,
right.
um, China is not going to allow that to happen. And the reason this particular crisis now exists is because the central government forced it. The
Mm,
central government told the likes of Evergrande and Country Garden and so on and so forth, we're not going to bail you out. You're going to go bankrupt. You're going to get reorganized. And we're not going to allow speculation in the property market. Property is for people's housing and not for speculators' gain.
yep.
And it's a very tough policy. They're willing
Mm,
to take a lot
the
of
hit, yeah.
risks,
Yeah.
but they're doing that in a very nasty way, and that's
Yeah.
what's happening. Now, of course, a lot of people are unhappy with that. It's
Mm,
the people who are dealing in Chinese property bonds are taking a very, very cold shower.
yeah.
And I think it's the right policy, absolutely. And that's what they need to do. Does it have any
Mm-hmm.
contagion effects for the
Right.
rest of the economy and so on? The answer is no. If
Mm,
there were contagion, then the one thing that would indicate that is the measure of contagion, the global measure of contagion, which is the so-called CDS, right?
right.
The
Let me take
so-called
it out
credit
now. Yeah.
default.
Fantastic. Yeah. Oops. Yeah. I
So
think
if
now
you
I'm
look
not being
at,
allowed to share the screen, but it's okay. We'll just have it superimposed later. So you're looking at the China 5-year CDS between 2008 and 2022. Of
right,
course, the rates are pretty
right.
high. 2008, 2009. This is of course in response perhaps to the Great
That's the
Recession.
U.S. That's the U.S. crisis, right?
Right.
So
Exactly.
2007, 2008, the
Right.
so-called subprime crisis, where I don't know. I mean, in the U.S., nobody looked at credit ratings any longer. If you wanted a
Yeah.
mortgage, you got one, and of course, that whole thing just went to hell in a basket. So, and pretty much had massive contagion effects.
Mm.
The world economy, the world financial system was in serious danger. One of the major things that allowed that from, or prevented that from happening was collaboration at the time with Hank Paulson, the U.S. Treasury Secretary, and
Goldman Sachs chief. Yeah.
Wang Qishan,
Yeah.
his equivalent in China, and China massively injected funds into the world economy, which allowed the matter to stabilize. But anyway, if you look further to the right now, to the current situation,
Right.
China's CDS is normal. And if anybody were to worry about some massive collapse or problems of the kind that happened in the US in 2008, that would not be the case. There's nobody, no credit default swap dealer who
Right.
wouldn't jump on the opportunity to sell if indeed this were the situation.
I mean, the
The
rates are
other thing
even
that,
lower than 2016, 2017, right? I mean, the rates were even higher. The CDS rate was even higher back in 2016.
yeah,
Just a question, Ova, because I have a lot of friends and colleagues, kind of in my age range, who have been complaining a lot about the real estate prices back in the day. It looks like they're a little bit more happy now because now you can perhaps get a proper 1 to 2 bedroom in places like Beijing and Shanghai, not at the $2-3 million range, but perhaps several $100,000 of range, and some would say even they're even better ones. But while the property market is cooling down to the benefit of younger generations who want to start their family, want to start their life and cannot afford the rent rates and all, the unemployment rate tends to be also very high among the youth, right? Especially among the Generation Z. What is your
Well,
understanding of that? Yeah,
that's the issue I mentioned.
yeah.
China is an economy in transition. It is
Mm,
in transition from a more standard export-driven economy like most of Southeast Asia is
right,
nowadays still, to a developed economy which is going to be based on high technology services and high technology manufacturing.
right.
And that's a process that takes investment. It takes qualified labor in
Right.
particular. That's very important. China has developed a qualified labor, and a lot of the people who are now looking for a job are looking for jobs in the high technology sector. They're engineers.
Yeah, the
China
Tencents and
produces,
ByteDance of this world, right? The Tencent, ByteDance,
yeah,
those type of tech companies. Yeah.
yeah, but not just those entertainment companies.
Mm,
The technology sector in
right.
China, what's much more important is the applications of 5G to the
Mm,
mining sector,
right.
automation of the mining sector. Tianjin Port, one of the largest ports in the world, over the past 2 years has been completely 100% automated.
Yes, yes,
There's
yes.
not a
Mm,
person any longer doing anything there. So you can unload a container ship in Tianjin in 45 minutes automatically. The same unloading in Los Angeles, in Long Beach,
right.
would take 2 days. Okay?
Yeah.
Think about the difference in productivity that you're talking about. But what is happening as this transition is occurring,
Mm,
the labor force has to be adjusted. The
yeah.
labor force, people who are not trained to be able to deal with 5G steerage in a port facility or a mining sector in Mongolia are not going to have a job. So that's the biggest problem. And what's needed here is massive private sector. I want to really stress that.
Right.
And the Chinese, it's very easy to get investment into from the big Chinese banks into the SOEs, into the state-owned enterprises, because they always look at the banks are state-owned. They know that if they lend to the state-owned enterprise, eventually they're going to be paid back, or at least they're not going to be blamed. But if they're lending to the
Right.
private sector,
Correct.
then they're taking a risk, right?
You're right. Yeah.
And so they're very reluctant to do so. And this is a big fight right now. The central government wants that kind of lending. The local governments are very, very reluctant in this regard.
Yeah.
And the fight is over this. And right now, what Xi Jinping is telling everybody is, we're going to let you go bust.
Mm, mm,
And we're not going to bail you out. What has to happen is a complete change in the economy with investment in highest technology and
right.
investment in these areas that will make China succeed. It's nasty, but it's happening. So,
Speaking of
uh,
transition, over, of course, we had reshuffles in the Politburo. Now we have, the replacement of Li Keqiang, who for a long time was the economy man, supposedly at, economics and all of that. Are you comfortable with the current group of top technocrats, whether in the finance ministry, whether the
absolutely. I mean,
or prime minister? Yeah,
Elon Musk recently said his favorite politician in the world is Li Qiang, the Chinese prime minister,
right,
who helped
exactly.
him build the most effective plant in the world in 9 months. He said if there were people around like that
In Shanghai, yeah,
in
in
Canada,
Shanghai, yeah, yeah, mm,
this was happened in Shanghai.
yeah,
He
yeah,
was the head of the governor, or rather the party head of Shanghai,
right,
before he became prime minister. And this the same type of plant built in near Berlin in Germany took 2.5 years and is still not done. So much for German efficiency. It been quite outdone by
Uwe,
what the
is
Chinese.
your airport done in Berlin? I didn't pass through the airport last time I took the train down from Munich. The big joke in Europe is always the Berlin airport, right? I mean, how long did it take? 10 years?
It took over 10 years
Yeah,
to
10
build.
years. Yeah,
It's
exactly.
finally functioning.
Yeah.
Right now it's a good airport, but I mean, think about the new Shanghai airport and
Yeah.
the relationship from the city, from Pudong to the airport, with the maglev train and so on and so forth.
Faster than a
Uh,
plane. Yeah, faster than a plane, even by some measure. I mean, I'm asking you because you're a German yourself, right, Ove? So I mean,
yeah,
it takes a German, to know about technological efficiency and all of that. Now, going back to this, speaking of also transition,
yeah.
some are saying, what about the U.S. shock? This whole the risk, the coupling. Now, obviously, you see that even the liberal talking heads, like the economists, are recognizing that the coupling or the risk strategy of U.S. is just pushing secondary countries like Vietnam and Mexico to be more dependent on China. And there are many cases of like solar panels from Vietnam. It says made in Vietnam, but it's actually made by Chinese companies and just renamed. Not to mention, China still has a lot of control on rare earths and a lot of key technological inputs. So it looks like the decoupling is
The
not as
whole thing
successful
is
as
a
it should be.
joke,
Yeah.
Richard. The whole thing is a joke. The United States, 40% of manufactured goods that the United States needs are imported from China. Okay, if China stopped exporting tomorrow to the United States, the country would shut down, and they're perfectly aware of that. Okay, so that's the way this thing is happening. We're just getting a message here.
Yeah, because it's not a commercial account, that's why it has a time limiter. So now let's
No,
try
it
to
does.
make the most out of the time limit while we have there. Uwe,
Yeah,
I have
okay.
another.
We can just upgrade that. It's not a
Yes,
problem.
sure.
So anyway, I think
Hmm.
the so-called decoupling
Or the
is not
risk.
happening.
Yeah.
What's happening is a massive recoupling or between China and essentially the global South. I mean, that
Mexico,
includes, of
Vietnam.
course,
Yeah, yeah,
that includes Southeast Asia. That
yeah.
includes, but it includes in particular the other BRICS countries such as South Africa and Brazil.
Hmm.
And there's the BRICS summit coming up at the end of August, which I believe as a journalist you should be watching very closely, because what's going to
Indeed.
happen there is be another massive shock to U.S. Imperial ambitions.
Uwe, I
So
mean, we're looking at the possibility of Saudi Arabia, Iran, Turkey, some of this also other rising emerging markets also being
yeah,
admitted, right? So everyone is watching this carefully. So imagine if Saudi Arabia comes in and potentially Argentina, Iran, Algeria, a number of other relatively big or mid-sized rising economies. And I think the symbolic value will be quite big. Obviously, a lot of people are paying attention also to the BRICS summit in South Africa because of the drama of Vladimir Putin not being able to attend due to the ICC issue and all. Uh, Now, you correctly, again, I mean, I'm not trying to divulge confidential discussion. We had a lot of discussions throughout the year last year, and you were quite confident that Russia can withstand the wave of Western sanctions. And in many ways, we can see that Russia so far has not suffered the kind of collapse that many people were anticipating in the West. Nevertheless, we saw some downward movements in the Russian ruble and some radical increase in the interest rates. And some would say there's some also disagreements among Putin's technocrats, especially the current central banker and his top economic advisor, so on and so forth. How are you looking at the Russia situation? Do you think that they're showing that they can make their economy resilient or immunize enough?
they have done a very remarkable job. It's very clear, though, that the reason that's been possible is because major countries with large populations such as India, China, Brazil and others have simply not gone along with the sanctions. You know, it's the U.S. expectations that they would be able to you know, force other countries to go along with the sanctions regime have simply not happened. The United States' ability to do so is zero. And India has basically told the United States to go fly kite. So,
Yeah.
and of course, so has China, and so has Brazil. Lula went to, to visit Washington and told Mr. Biden, "We're not part of your game." Okay? And you know, that's one of my biggest problems as an editor of a major newspaper, and you as a journalist, I think, that the actual news about these kind of developments does not get into the Western mainstream media, and people have a completely false understanding of what's going on around the world. Literally 78% of the world population is governed by governments that do not subscribe to U.S. sanctions.
Sanctions, yeah. Although, as I mentioned, we mentioned in terms of the condemnation resolution, solidarity
In
with
terms
Ukraine.
of what
Yeah.
who the hell cares about condemnation? I mean, I don't know. I can
You're a
condemn
little
them.
bit too realpolitik compared to me, Uwe. But that's what I appreciate with our discussion. Uwe, nevertheless, I mean, I agree with you that even we saw that also in the case of Iran after the reimposition of sanctions by Trump, that they were able to create an economy that's still growing at 1 to 2 to 3% or potentially even 4% this year. So there is a strong evidence that the Western sanctions cannot bring some of these rising powers to their knees. Having said that, though, I mean, Uwe, I mean, you're familiar with Russia's science and technology. They're great workforce. Up to 1 million people have emigrated out of Russia. Russia is not growing. Perhaps it could have grown 5, 6, 7%, not 1 to 2%. There's still a kind of opportunity cost here, right? In some ways, that this war is not breaking Russia down.
Richard, how many people have immigrated to the city of Berlin alone from Ukraine?
Yeah,
what do you think? Okay, 1.5 million. There are more Ukrainians that have gone to one German city than have entirely immigrated from Russia. Okay, the disaster.
Well, Uwe, because they're being invaded. I mean, they're the invaded country, right? So obviously, you can
so
expect.
what? Why do you run away when you're invaded? I mean, if you're going to fight, then why don't you fight instead of running away? This is going to go down the tubes, buddy. And you know, when it gets, you know, finally we have the major Western press saying so. Right? The Washington Post article yesterday saying this is the end of the story. Right? And you know, that's what's happening. And I told you that 3 months ago. That this
we had this conversation.
Okay? This vaunted great offensive was not going to go anywhere because the Russians made military mistakes. The Russians always made military mistakes initially.
World War I,
the Germans pushed them all the way to Moscow, and after 3 years, they pushed the Germans back to Berlin and destroyed the place. Napoleon went there and had a great time and burned Moscow. And a year later, hardly a soldier of Napoleon's made it back to Paris. Karl XII of Sweden invaded Russia and initially did so very successfully and was completely defeated. This is what people completely underestimate and misunderstand Russian history. Of course, this is not a great example of a democratic country, but you know, it's a country that does its stuff in the way in which it does. And the ability of the United States or Ms. Victoria Nuland or whatever to do something about it, I think is, thank God, very limited. The United States should get its own house in order, which is in disorder to an extent which I think is also becoming very obvious to the rest of the world.
Indeed, it's obvious. Just last question, perhaps on this. I think we're gonna catch up again after the BRICS summit. I'm sure we'll have interesting discussion. Let's do that in a few week time. Just last question. What is your sense here? Because I agree that the asymmetry is huge. The impact on the Ukrainian economy is far worse than the impact on the Russian economy. They're a far smaller country. It's not clear how much reconstruction aid they're going to get from US or even Europe for that matter. Do you see the status quo persisting for a long time? Because I look at some of the papers coming out of Russia. It looks like Putin is preparing Russia for a long-term intermediate war footing kind of situation in terms of their
Oh,
economy and all.
no, no.
Yeah.
Putin went to Rostov-on-Don, to the military headquarters yesterday, and told them we are preparing a major offensive. And if that offensive happens, as you will be able to look at it from the area of Sumy and then from the area of Kupiansk, where the Russians have been pushing the Ukrainians back much further than the Ukrainians have been able to push the Russians back in the south. If that happens, then Kharkov, the second largest city in Ukraine, is going to be actually from two sides going to be surrounded. And that will be the end of the story.
So you're saying,
no, this is going to end. This is going to end, and it's not going to end with a Ukrainian victory. I think the only thing that, and this is the CIA knows that and told Washington Post, okay, this is not going to happen. So this is going to be either lost or the Ukrainians get some smarts in their head and make some deal with the Russians and with Putin and agree a ceasefire. If not, they're going to lose the entire country.
On that note, thank you very much, Uwe, for sharing your point of view. We may have some difference here and there, but I always appreciate you sharing your honest and very German frankness point of view. Looking forward to catching up with you on BRICS and also latest developments on the Russian-Ukrainian front in the coming weeks.
Yeah, let's by all means do that.
Thank you, Sean.
Okay.
Have a good day.
Sure.
God bless.
All right. Cheers.
Okay. Cheers. Okay. Alright guys, thank you very much for listening. Sorry, medyo naging short kasi medyo hindi pa namin naayos yung isang Zoom account namin na meron beyond 30-40 minutes time limit. But as you see, I'm as fair as possible. We talk to people with very diverse range of views. Obviously, in the case of Uwe Parpart, he's someone who worked in the Wall Street. He's now based in Hong Kong, very switched on development in China. And he always had, quite different, and some would say contrarian views on Russia and all of that. And that's why I always appreciated, having honest and frank discussions with him. So please, stay in tune. We're going to have more conversations like this. Again, it doesn't have to be always like-minded people. And Uwe knows also where I stand on issues like Ukraine and China. I share his cautious optimism about China getting it through this transition period. I think it's very hard to bet against China or bet on a China collapse situation. China's over and over again shown us how dynamic of people they are. Nevertheless, I didn't get to hear it from Uwe, but I do believe that China's era of 6, 7, 8% growth is over forever. So I think we're looking realistically, real numbers at 3 to 5% growth for China in the foreseeable future. So their growth has dramatically slowed down. So a lot of projections about China becoming the number one in the next decade or so have to be revisited. I think China can become number one in a decade or two, but they can still be overtaken by US, India, and others later down the century. So there is an element of China peak, but yes, I agree that China collapse is a kind of a premature wishful thinking by a lot of Western thinkers. And as I said, no less than some very liberal thinkers in the Peterson Institute for International Economics have very good papers on showing the long-term resilience of the Chinese economy. And then on the Russia-Ukraine situation, obviously, no, my stand on this, I think Putin really made a huge mistake. If Uwe, in a different interview, said that, he shared his point of view on that. But I think Uwe also belongs to this group of people. I think Henry Kissinger also, among others, has also made this point that, at the end of the day, it's really also up to Ukraine to decide on the future of this. If Ukraine is going to continue with this counteroffensive, Russia is not going to give up on what they're holding on. So we're in a very, very difficult, tricky situation like that. And yeah, Russia has shown that they can immunize their economy the same way the Iranians were able to do to a large degree after their imposition of Western sanction. But to be honest, I think if you talk to a lot of Western experts, they themselves also knew that you cannot bring down to knees countries as large as this, whether it's Russia, Iran, etc. But if you impose just enough damage on them, at least in the long run, they cannot be competitive rivals. And I don't think Russia is going to be a long-term competitive rival overall in ways that China can still become. Yeah, I appreciate this discussion, and I hope you guys also appreciate what we're doing, getting points of view from different standpoints. So again, just to be clear, OV Power Party is of course the publisher and editor at the Asia Times, which is one of the oldest business magazines in Asia. It used to be the Far Eastern Economic Review, and he comes from a background of a venture capitalist businessman in Wall Street, in Japan also in the past, and now in China. So he also brings some unique point of view into this. Not to mention, of course, he has also background in mathematics and war. So he knows a bit better than me when it comes to actual on the ground warfare realities. Okay? So I hope we can continue this discussion, and hopefully next time hindi may time limit yung Zoom namin, ayusin pa namin yan. Thank you very much guys, and God bless.